The Michael Mystery. Chapter 1. At the Dawn of the Michael Age. Until the 9th century after the mystery of Golgotha, man's attitude towards his faults was different from later. He did not have the feeling that he himself was producing the faults that lived within his soul. He looked upon them as promptings, instilled into him from a spiritual world. Even when he had thoughts about what he perceived with his senses, these thoughts were to him revelations of the divinity, speaking to him out of the things of sense. Anyone who has spiritual vision understands this feeling. For when a spiritual reality imparts itself to the soul, one never has the feeling. There stands the spiritual perception, and oneself must construct the thoughts with which to comprehend this perception. But one sees the thought along with the perception, given with and contained in it, as objective as the perception itself. With the 9th century, all such dates must of course be taken as giving about the middle of the time. The transition takes place quite gradually. There awoke in men's souls the light of the personal, individual intelligence. Man began to have the feeling, I construct my thoughts. And this construction of thoughts became so preeminent a feature of the soul's life that thinkers regarded the essence of the human soul as residing in this, its intelligent behavior. Until then, people had an imaginative conception of the soul. They looked on her essential being as residing not in the construction of thoughts, but in her participation in the intelligent, spiritual substance of the world. People thought of the supersensual spirit beings as thinking, and they work into man. They think into him too. And what thus lives in man is his part in the supersensible spiritual world. This they felt as soul. Directly one's views are carried higher into the spiritual world, one meets with concrete spiritual powers in the form of living beings. To that power, from whom proceed the thoughts of things, they gave, in old teachings, the name of Michael. Keeping the name, one may say that it was Michael from whom men once received their thoughts. Michael was regent of the cosmic intelligence. From the time of the 9th century on, men ceased to have a sense that their thoughts were inspired by Michael. Thoughts had fallen from Michael's dominion and sunk from the spiritual world into the individual souls of men. The development of thought life was carried on now by men in the human sphere. At first, people were uncertain what these thoughts were, which they had. This uncertainty runs through the teachings of the scholastics. They were divided into two schools, realists and nominalists. The realists, with Thomas Aquinas and his circle at their head, still felt the old connection between thought and thing, as both belonging together. Accordingly, they looked on the thoughts as actual realities existing in the things. The thoughts of a man they viewed as a real something flowing from the things into his soul. The nominalists had a strong feeling of the fact that the soul makes her own thoughts. They felt thoughts as something purely subjective, which exists in the soul and has nothing whatever to do with the things. In their opinion, thoughts were only the names men made for things. The scholastics spoke of universals, not of thoughts, but this does not affect the general principle of their outlook, since thoughts always bear a universal character in regard to the single things. The realists wanted, one might say, to remain loyal to Michael, Even though the faults had fallen from his domain and into that of men, they yet wanted as thinkers to go on serving Michael as Prince of Intelligence in the cosmos. The nominalists, in the unconscious part of their souls, completed the falling away from Michael. They regarded not Michael, but man as the owner of faults. Nominalism spread and gained increasing hold, and so it went on until the last third of the 19th century. Then came the age when those who can read the spiritual events taking place in the universe became aware that Michael had rejoined the stream of intellectual life. He is pursuing a new metamorphosis of his cosmic office. Before, he sent the stream of thoughts from the outer spiritual world into the souls of men. Now, since the last third of the 19th century, he seeks to dwell within the human souls, where thoughts are being formed. Before, the human beings who were spiritually akin to Michael watched him perform his work in spirit regions. Now, they know that they must give him his home in their hearts. Now they dedicate to Michael their own thought-informed, thought-sustained spiritual life, now in free, individual thought life. They seek counsel from Michael as to their soul's right path. People who in their previous earth lives were familiar with thought in its inspired form, who were servants, that is, of Michael, felt themselves drawn to this voluntary communion with Michael when they returned to earth life at the close of the 19th century. They looked upon him, who had been their old thought-inspirer, as their guide henceforth in the higher form of thinking. Those who have eyes for such things could not but be aware of the revolution that took place in respect to men's thought life during the last third of the 19th century. Before this, man could only feel the thoughts arising and taking shape out of his own being. Ever since then, he can rise above his own individual being. He can guide his mind into the realm of the spirit, and there Michael meets him. Michael, who from old is past mastering all thought weaving. He frees the thoughts from the region of the head. He opens a free way for them to the heart. He sets free the springs of spiritual fervour from the hearts of men, so that man may live in full soul's devotion to all that he may learn in the light of thought. The age of Michael has dawned. Hearts are beginning to have thoughts. The springs of spiritual fervour no longer flow from the darkness only of mystical feeling, but from clear soul brightness, thought-informed and thought-sustained. To understand this is to receive Michael into the heart. Thoughts which seek today to grasp. The spirit must spring from hearts that throb for Michael, the fiery thought king of the universe. The Michael Mystery, Chapter 2. The Human Soul Before the Dawn of the Michael Age. The rise of the Michael Age has succeeded in mankind's evolution to the predominance, on the one hand, of the intellectual form of thought construction, and on the other, of an external view of the world, paramountly directed to the physical world in its outer sensible aspect. Thought construction is not in itself of its own character, a development in the direction of materialism. What in earlier ages had come to man as though it be inspiration, the world of ideas, became, in the time that preceded the Michael Age, a property of the human soul. The soul no longer receives her ideas given to her from above out of the spiritual fullness of the cosmos. She fetches them forth actively out of the inner spiritual life of man himself. With this, man becomes ripe for the first time to reflect upon his own individual spirit being. Previously, He never penetrated to this depth in his own being. He saw in himself, so to speak, a drop separated out for the span of his earth life from the sea of cosmic spirit, to reunite it with again after this earth life is over. This thought construction that takes place in man is a forward step in man's self-knowledge. Viewed in its supersensible aspect, the matter lies as follows. The spiritual powers, whom we may call by the name of Michael, ruled ideas in the spiritual cosmos. Man realized these ideas within him, inasmuch as his own soul participated in the life of the Michael world. This realization of the life of ideas has now become his own personal concern, and this has brought about a temporary separation of man from the Michael world. Along with the inspired thoughts of earlier ages, man had received at the same time the spiritual substance of the world. Now that this inspiration has ceased, and man begins of his own action to construct his thoughts, he is thrown back upon the perceptions of his senses to give these thoughts a substance. So that man at first could not do otherwise than fill his newly acquired inner spiritual life with a material substance. He acquired inner spiritual life with a material substance. He fell into the materialist view of things in that same age, which carried his own inner spiritual being to a stage higher than those preceding it. This is a fact which may easily be misinterpreted. One may look only at the fall into materialism and deplore it accordingly. But whilst the views of this age were thus limited in outlook to the external physical world, there arose within the soul as a realization of the inner being, a purified, unalloyed and self-sustaining spirit life of the human mind that must remain no longer an unconscious realization. It must become knowingly aware of its own peculiar character. This means that Michael in being must enter into the human soul. For a period, man has taken the matter of the natural world as a filling for his own spirit. He must once again fill it with the spirit substance of the cosmos out of his own creative mind. Thought construction lost itself for a while in the material of the cosmos. It must come to itself once more in the cosmic spirit. Into the cold and abstract world of thought may enter warmth and the living fullness of spirit's reality. This announces the dawn of the Michael age. Only in separation from the living thought reality of the world could there grow up in the human soul the consciousness of freedom. What came from the heights had again to be recovered from the depths. Therefore, the development of this consciousness of freedom is involved in its first beginnings with that science of the natural world which is directed solely to the world's external aspect. Whilst inwardly man was unconsciously developing his spirit to pure clarity of ideas, outwardly his senses were directed solely to the world of matter, that left undisturbed the first tender shoots of what was dawning in his soul. But into these views of external materiality there may enter anew a living inner realization of the spirit in the world, and therewith once more a spiritual view of it. The science of nature that has been acquired under the sign of materialism may receive a spiritual form of conception in the inner life of the soul. Michael, who once spoke from above, may be heard from within, where he will make his new abode. In more imaginative language it may be thus expressed: that sun life, which through long ages man drew from without, from the cosmos only, will begin to shine within, in the soul. Man will learn to speak of an inner sun. He will know none the less well on this account that he is a being of the earth in his life between birth and death, but he will be conscious that his own being is sun-guided on its earthly travels. He will learn to be aware in truth of a being that lives within him and that sheds a light which lights the life of earth, but is not lit there. In the first dawn of the Michael Age, it may still seem as though mankind were very far from all this. But in the spirit it is not far, it is close at hand, it only needs to be seen. That man's ideas do not remain merely thinking only, but turn in thought to seeing, is a fact on which immeasurably much depends. The Michael Mystery, Chapter 3. The Pre-Michaelite Way and the Way of Michael. We shall fail to find the right light upon the new Michael impulse now making its way into human evolution, if we form that conception of the relation between the modern world of ideas and the world of nature, which is common at the present day. The usual notion is this: outside is the natural world with its things and processes. Inside are the ideas. The ideas represent concepts of the things of nature, or else of the so-called laws of nature. The primary concern of thinkers is then to show how to construct those particular ideas which bear the requisite relation to the things of nature, or from which the true laws of nature may be deduced. In all this, they attach very little importance to the connection between these ideas and the man who has them, and yet the real gist of the matter remains unrecognized, unless the question first be raised: what is man going through with the natural science ideas of modern times? An answer may be arrived at as follows. Man's feeling today is that ideas are evolved within him by the special activity of his soul. He has the feeling that he himself is the evolver of his ideas, whereas his perceptions intrude upon him from without. This feeling is not one which man already had. In older times, the contents of his ideas seemed to him not something manufactured by himself, but received by way of suggestion from the supersensible world. It is a feeling that has passed through different stages, and the stages depended upon the particular part of his being, with which man realized what he today calls his ideas. Today is the age of the spiritual soul's evolution, when the statement holds good without reservation, which was made in the recent leading thoughts. The thoughts of man have their true seat in the etheric body. There, however, they are forces of real life and being. They imprint themselves upon the physical body, and as such imprinted thoughts, they have the shadowy character in which the everyday consciousness knows them. One may go back into times when thoughts were realized directly with the eye. Then, however, they were not, as now, shadowy. They were not even merely living. They were endowed with soul and permeated with spirit, which means that man did not think thoughts. He realized a direct perception of concrete spiritual beings. A form of consciousness such as this, which looks above to a world of spiritual beings, is everywhere to be found amongst the different peoples in their early ages. What remains of it, preserved in history, is termed today the myth-creating consciousness. Man is in the midst of his own true world, the world of his origin, whereas with the present-day consciousness, he withdraws himself from his own world. Man is spirit, and man's world is the world of spiritual beings. Then there comes a next stage, where thought is no longer realized by the eye, but by the astral body. There, the direct spirituality is lost to the soul's perception. Thought appears as living and endowed with soul. In the first stage, the vision of concrete forms of spiritual being, man feels no impellent need to bring what his vision shows him into any nearer relation with the world perceived by his senses. The world's sensible phenomena reveal themselves, it is true, as being the deeds of that which is beheld by a supersensible vision, but to construct a special science of what is directly, spiritually visible to the mind's eye is not a matter of urgent necessity. Moreover, the world of spirit beings, shown by vision, presents such a wealth that the attention is arrested by this above everything else. A change comes with the second stage of consciousness. The concrete spirit beings conceal themselves. Their reflected glory becomes apparent as ensouled life. Men begin to bring the life of nature into relation with this life of souls. They search the things of nature and the processes of nature for the spirit beings at work there and for their spiritual needs. In what later appeared as alchemy and the pursuits of the alchemists can be seen historically the residue of this stage of consciousness. And as, when thinking spirit beings in the first stage of consciousness, man was living completely in his own world of being, so even at this second stage he is still quite close to himself and to his own first source. This, however, means that at both stages all possibility is excluded of man's coming in the true sense to any inner personal impulse for his actions. Spiritual being, of a kind akin to himself, acts in him. What he seems to be doing is the open manifestation of events enacted between spirit beings. What man does is the sensibly physical appearance of an actual divine spiritual process taking place behind it. A third epoch in the evolution of consciousness brings thoughts to consciousness in the etheric body, but still as living thoughts. The Greek of civilization, in the days of its greatness, lived in this form of consciousness. The ancient Greek, when thinking, did not construct a thought with which he viewed the world as through a construction of his own, but he felt aroused within himself the stir of that same life, which, outside too, pulsed through the things and processes around him. Then, for the first time, there arose the longing for freedom of personal action. Not as yet actual freedom, but the longing for it. In the human being who felt the stir of nature stirring within himself, there grew up a longing to separate his own life stir from the life stir that he saw going on in the outer world, foreign to him. But nevertheless, this life stir in the outer world was still felt as a last outcome of that real and active spirit world, which is of the same kind with man. Not until thoughts took their print in the physical body, and consciousness extended only to this physical imprint, did the possibility of freedom first begin. This is the state of things, as it was in the 15th century after Christ. In the world's evolution, the bearing which the ideas of the modern conception of nature may have upon nature herself is a matter of no moment, for these ideas did not assume their present form in order to supply a particular picture of the natural world, but in order to bring man to a particular stage of its evolution. When thoughts laid hold on the physical body, they lost from their immediate contents spirit, soul, and life. These were blotted out, and the abstract shadow that haunts the physical body alone remains. Physical material things alone can be the objects of knowledge for such thoughts as these. For such thoughts themselves are only actual in man's physical material body. The reason why materialism arose is not that only material things and processes are to be seen in the outer world of nature. It is because man in his evolution had to go through a stage which brought him to a form of consciousness that is at first only capable of seeing material revelations. The one-sided development of this requirement in human evolution has resulted in the modern view of the natural world. Michael's mission is to convey to men's ether bodies those forces by which the thought shadows may again acquire life, To these new enlivened shadows, souls and spirits from the supersensible worlds above will incline themselves. And with these, man, unbounded and free, will be able to dwell with them of old, when he was merely the physical image of their workings. Leading thoughts. In the evolution of mankind, consciousness comes down step by step along the ladder of thought development. There is a first stage of consciousness. Here man realizes thoughts in his I, as being imbued with spirit, soul and life. Then comes a second stage, where man realizes thoughts in his astral body. Here they appear rather as living and soul-endowed images of the spirit being. At a third stage, the thoughts are realized in man's ether body. Here they are only an inner life stir, like the after-echo of a life of soul. At the fourth stage, the present one, thoughts are realized by man in his physical body and represent dead shadows of the spirit. In proportion as spirit, soul and life recede from human thinking, man's own will comes to life, freedom grows possible. It is Michael's task to lead man back by the paths of will, thither whence first he came, when on the paths of thought he descended from the realization of the supersensible world to the realization of the sensible world in his earthly consciousness. The Michael Mystery, Chapter 4, Michael's Task in the Sphere of Ahriman. When man looks back over his own evolution and reviews in spirit the peculiar character which his spiritual life has assumed during the last 5 centuries, he cannot but recognize even in his ordinary consciousness, however dimly, that in these 5 centuries he has come to a critical turning point in the whole earthly evolution of mankind. In the last letter I pointed out this critical turn in evolution from one of its aspects. One may look back namely into earlier ages of this evolution. Then we observe how a transformation took place in that soul force in man, which today is employed as the force of intelligence. Thoughts now appear within the field of human consciousness, dead, abstract thoughts. These thoughts are tied to the physical human body. Man must recognize them as his own progeny. When in days of yore, man turned his soul's gaze in the direction where now his own thoughts appear to him, he then beheld divine spirit beings. He saw his whole existence bound up with these beings, in all that he was, down to his physical body. He must confess himself the product of these beings, not only their product in all that he was, but also in all that he did. Man had no will of his own. All that he did was a manifestation of divine will. Step by step, as described in the last letter, the stage has been reached of a personal will of man's own, for which the time began about 500 years ago. The last stage, however, differs more markedly from all the preceding ones than these do from one another. As the thoughts pass over into the physical body, they lose their aliveness, they become dead, spiritual dead constructions. Previously, whilst pertaining to man, they were yet at the same time organs of the divine spirit beings, to whom man himself pertained. They willed in man as living forms of being, and hence man felt himself through them livingly bound to the spiritual world. With his dead thoughts, he feels himself released from the spiritual world. He feels himself planted down completely into the physical world. But hereby he is at the same time brought into the sphere of the Ahrimanic mind. The Ahrimanic form of mind has no great power in those regions, where the beings of the higher hierarchies keep man within their own immediate sphere, either by working within him themselves, as in primeval times, or, as later, by the brightness of their ensouled or living reflection. So long as the workings of supersensible beings continue in this way to enter into all the workings of man, until that is about the 15th century AD, the powers of Ahriman find within the field of human evolution only a faint echo, one might say, of their strength. The picture drawn by the Persian world view of the workings of Ahriman is in no contradiction to the above statement. For what is meant in the Persian view of Ahriman's workings is not something going on in the evolution of the human soul, but within the neighbouring world that borders on man's soul world. From this neighbouring world of spirit the web of Ahriman's weaving undoubtedly sent its threads across the world of the human soul, but did not directly encroach upon it. Any such direct encroachment only became possible in the period that began some 500 years ago. Thus man stands at the end of a stream of evolution in which his own human being has been built up by a form of divine spirit being, which passes finally into the abstract intelligence personality of man, and there, so far as itself is concerned, died out. Man has not remained in those spheres where he had his own first source in the divine spirit being. What was thus accomplished 500 years ago for man's consciousness had already taken place on a broader scale throughout his general being at the time when the mystery of Golgotha entered upon its earthly manifestation. This was the time when human evolution began, imperceptibly as yet for the consciousness of most people of that period, to slide gradually down out of a world where Ahriman has but little power into one where he has very much. It was in the 15th century that this downslide from one world stratum into another reached its final completion. Here, in this world stratum, it becomes possible for Ahriman to exert his influence upon man, and with disastrous effects, because in this stratum the divine influences congenial to man have died out. But there was no other possible way for man to arrive at the development of his free will, save by withdrawing to a sphere in which those divine spirit beings had no life, who were involved with him from his origin. In the very essence of this human evolution, cosmically viewed, lies the mystery of the sun. With the sun and all that man, down to the important turning point in his evolution, could see in the sun, were involved divine spiritual beings of his origin. These beings have detached themselves from the sun and left on it only their extinct remains, so that what man now receives through the sun, taken up into his bodily system, is the power of dead thoughts only. But these divine beings have sent Christ from the sun to earth. He, for the salvation of mankind, has united his own living being with the deadness of divine existence in the kingdom of Ahriman. Mankind have thus the twofold possibility, which is the pledge of their freedom, either to turn to Christ in that mind and spirit which was theirs subconsciously when they came down from the vision of supersensible life in the spirit until they could use intelligence, but to do this now in consciousness, or else in their detachment from spirit life, to seek to enjoy the sense of themselves, and thereby fall a prey to the powers of Ahriman, and be carried in the Ahrimanic direction of evolution. Such is the situation of mankind since the beginning of the 15th century. It has been preparing, for everything proceeds gradually in evolution, ever since the time of the mystery of Golgotha, that greatest of all earthly events, which is designed to save man from the destruction to which he is unavoidably exposed in order to become a free being. Now it is true to say, what has been done by mankind in this situation hitherto has been achieved half unconsciously. In this half-conscious way it has led to what is good in a view of nature living in abstract ideas, and also to many equally beneficent principles in the conduct of practical life. But the age has gone by, when man could afford to pursue his existence unconsciously in the dangerous Ahrimanic sphere. The scientific observer of the spiritual world is today obliged to rouse mankind's attention to the spiritual fact that Michael has now succeeded to the guidance of human affairs. Whatever Michael performs is performed in such a way as to exert no influence from his part upon man, but they are free to follow him, and so, in freedom, with the Christ power to find their way out again from Ahriman's sphere, which they entered of necessity. Whoever honestly, from the innermost core of his soul, can feel himself one with anthroposophy, is a true interpreter of this Michael phenomenon. Anthroposophy is intended to be the message of this Michael mission. Leading thoughts. Michael travels upwards again over the paths which mankind travelled downwards through the successive steps of the spirit's evolution to the exercise of intelligence. Only by Michael the will be led up the track which was descended by wisdom until she came to her intelligence, her final stage. From this point in the world's evolution, Michael merely shows his road so that mankind may walk on it in freedom. And this is what distinguishes this particular regency of Michael's from the previous regencies of all other archangels, indeed from all those of Michael himself until now. These other regencies worked as active forces within man, and did not merely show him their own workings, so that man in those times could not be free in his. To recognize this is the task of man at this present day, so that with his entire soul he may find his own right spiritual road during the age of Michael. The Michael Mystery, Chapter 5. Michael's experiences in the fulfillment of his cosmic mission. The progress of mankind may be traced from the stage of consciousness where man still felt himself part of the divine spiritual order, down to the present one, where he learns to feel himself an individuality, detached from divine spiritual being, and able to make use of his own thoughts. One may trace this from the point of view of mankind, as was done in the previous letter. One may also, however, through supersensible vision, sketch a picture of the experiences of Michael and his company during the same tide of evolution, describe, that is, the same series of facts from the point of view of Michael. This shall now be attempted. There is, to begin with, a very early age in which one can only really speak of what goes on amongst divine spiritual beings. It is one series of the action of gods with which one has here to do. Gods perform what the impulses of their own individual natures suggest to them. They find their appropriate satisfaction in this activity, and how they are affected by it all is the sole matter in view. Only in one corner of the field of the gods' goings may be seen something that looks like mankind. Mankind is a part of the gods' activity. There is one spiritual being, however, who from the very first has turned his eyes upon mankind. This is Michael. He arranges, so to speak, the doings of the gods, so that man can exist in a cosmic corner. And his mode of activity in doing this is analogous to that which displays itself later in man as intellect, only that with him it is an active stream of force that flows throughout the cosmos, introducing orders of ideas and bringing cause to effect in fact. In this force Michael is at work. It is his office to administer the intellectuality of the cosmos. He desires further progress, namely that the force which works as intelligence throughout the whole cosmos should hereafter be concentrated in the individuality of man. The consequence is that there comes a time in the world's evolution when the cosmos no longer lives by its present, but by its past intelligence, while the present intelligence is in the human stream of evolution. Michael wants to keep this intelligence, that is growing up in mankind, in continuous connection with the divine spiritual being. To this, however, there is an obstacle. The whole line of evolution travelled through by the gods, from the point where the intellectual force is set free from their cosmic working, to where it becomes incorporated in man's nature, lies open as a patent fact in the world. Supposing there to be any beings possessed of the faculty to see these facts, they could turn them to their own account. And such beings do actually exist, namely the Ahrimanic beings. Their whole form of being predisposes them to absorb into themselves any kind of intelligence that becomes detached from the gods. They are suited to assimilate into their own being the entire sum of intellectuality of every kind. Thereby they grow to be the greatest, the most comprehensive, and most penetrating intelligences in the whole cosmos. Michael can foresee how man, as he attains ever more and more to the private use of intelligence, must needs come into contact with these Ahrimanic beings, and may then be tempted to an alliance with them, and so fall their prey. Michael therefore puts the Ahrimanic powers beneath his feet, drives them constantly down into deeper regions, below the one where man is pursuing his development. Michael, with his foot upon the dragon, thrusting him into the abyss. Such is the stupendous picture, as it lives within human consciousness, of these deeds in the supersensible world. Evolution moves onward. The intellectual force, which at first lay wholly within the domain of divine spirituality, now becomes so far detached as to give soul to the cosmos. What formerly had shot forth only as beams from the gods, now shines as revealed glory of the Godhead from the world of stars. Before, the world was guided by the divine being itself. Now it is guided by the divine revelation, which has come to be objective, and behind which the divine being is passing through the next stage of its own evolutionary course. Here again, Michael is regent of the cosmic intelligence, inasmuch as this intelligence flows as an ordering stream of ideas through all the revelations of the cosmos. The third phase of evolution is a still further detachment of the cosmic intelligence from its original source. It is no longer the present order ideas which now rules the star worlds as divine revelation, but the stars guide and group themselves in their courses in accordance with the order of ideas which was implanted in them in the past. Michael sees that which was under his sway in the cosmos, the intellectuality of the cosmos, ever more and more taking its way to mankind on earth. And Michael sees too that the danger of mankind's falling into the snares of the Ahrimanic powers is becoming ever greater. For himself, he knows that he will always have Ahriman beneath his feet, but can he do the same for man? He sees the greatest of all events on earth take place. Out of that realm of which Michael was himself the servant, the Christ being descends into the sphere of earth, that he may be at hand when the power of intelligence shall have passed completely over to the human individual. For then will come the time when the urge will be strongest in man, wholly to give himself to that power, which in every particular and in consummate perfection has made itself the bearer of the intellectual force. But Christ will be at hand. Through his great sacrifice he will live in the same sphere where Ahriman dwells. Man will have the choice between Christ and Ahriman. The world will be able in mankind's evolution to find the way of Christ. Such are Michael's experiences with the cosmic regency. In order to remain with that, of which he was regent in the cosmos, he takes the road from the cosmos to mankind. He's been upon the road since the 8th century of Christianity, but only really entered upon his earthly office, into which his cosmic office is transformed, in the last third of the 19th century. Michael has no power to compel men to anything, for the very fact that intelligence has passed completely into the domain of human individuality means of itself the end of all compulsion. But in the supersensible world that borders on the physical, Michael can perform before men, in a majestic act of imaginative ritual for their imitation, what he desires to do. There he may display himself in an aura of light, in a spirit gesture, in which is revealed all the glory and majesty of the past intelligence of God. There he may visibly demonstrate how this intelligence of the past is even now, in its effects in the present, truer and lovelier and more virtuous than all that in false, delusive splendour proceeds in the immediate present-day intelligence from Ahriman. There he may let men see how, for him, Ahriman must always be the baser spirit underneath his feet. Those who can look into the supersensible world which lies next to the physical one, see Michael there, even as he is here described, and see what he and his company are trying to do for men. Such people see how in freedom man is to be guided by the picture of Michael in the sphere of Ahriman, away from Ahriman to Christ. If, through their own seeing, these people can succeed in opening the hearts and minds of other men as well, so that there may be a group of people who know how Michael is now dwelling amongst men, then mankind will make a beginning towards celebrating the festival of Michael in its true reality. For in such festivals, human souls will awaken to life within themselves the power of Michael. Then will Michael be working as an actual power amongst men. Man will be free, and yet in innermost communion with Christ as he journeys on his spiritual lifeway through the cosmos. Leading thoughts. To awake to a true consciousness of the Michael influence in the spiritual complex of the world is to solve the problem of human freedom from its cosmic complexities, so far as its solution is necessary for man upon earth. For freedom is a fact of direct experience for every man who understands himself in the present period of human evolution. No one, without denying a patent fact, can venture to say, there is no freedom. Yet one may find a contradiction between the fact thus actually given and the processes of the cosmos. The ground of contradiction ceases in contemplation of Michael's mission in the cosmos. In my philosophy of freedom, the freedom of man's being in the present world age will be found demonstrated as an actual subject of inner consciousness. In the picture here given of the Michael mission may be found the cosmic arguments for this freedom's evolution. Michael Mystery, Chapter 6, Mankind's Future and the Work of Michael. How does man stand today, at his present stage of evolution, with regard to Michael and Michael's company? Man stands over against a world which once was wholly divine, spiritual being, divine spiritual being, of which he himself was a living part. The world, therefore, in those times when world and man belonged together, was a world of divine spiritual being. In a following stage of evolutionary progress, this has ceased. The world was then the cosmic revelation of divine spirit. The divine spirit in its essential being hovered behind the revelation. Yet still it weaved and lived in this, its revealed glory. A world of stars was there. In their shining and their motion, divine spirit weaved and lived as revelation. One may say that in the place of a star standing, in those days, or in the manner of its moving, might directly be seen the action of divine spirit. In all that here went on, the manner in which the divine spirit wrought within the cosmos, the life of man, as he grew up in every way a product of divine spiritual action in the cosmos, in all of this, Michael was still in his own element unopposed. He was mediator in the relations of the divinity to man. Other times came. The star world ceased to be the immediate and present bearer of the divine spiritual action. Its life and motion was but the persistent continuation of the same form of action which had once worked within it. Divine Spirit lived no longer in the cosmos as revelation, but only as workings. A marked distinction had now taken place between the divine spiritual and the cosmic. They had become two against the Ahrimanic powers, which will save us from falling into their snare. To understand the meaning of the Michael mission in the cosmos means the ability to speak like this. One must be able in these days to speak about the world of nature in the way demanded by the present stage of the spiritual soul's development. One must be able to make one's mind familiar with the purely scientific, naturalistic mode of thought. But one must also learn to speak, which means to feel, about the world of nature too in a manner befitting the Christ. Not only about redemption from nature, not only about the soul and things divine, but about the cosmos. We must learn the Christ language. That our human link with our first divine spiritual origin may be so preserved, that we may know how rightly to speak the Christ language about the cosmos, there is something to which we shall in the end attain, if with inward sincerity of heart we learn to feel and ever more fully enter into all that Michael and Michael's company are amongst us, in their mission, in all that they perform. For to understand Michael means, today, to find the way to the Logos, as lived by Christ amongst men on earth. Anthroposophy sets due value upon all that the naturalistic form of scientific thought has learnt to say about the world during the last 400 to 500 years. But anthroposophy has another language to speak besides this one, about the being of man, the evolution of man, the growth of the cosmos. Anthroposophy would speak the Christ-Michael language. For if both languages are spoken, then the continuity will remain unbroken, and evolution will not pass over to Ahriman before finding again its first divine spiritual origin. The language of the natural sciences by itself alone, in a manner of speech that befits the detachment of the intellectual force from the divine spirit of its origin. It may become the language of Ahriman, if Michael's mission be neglected. It will not do so if, through the might of Michael's great example, the freed and detached intellect comes to itself once more in that cosmic intellectual power of the beginning, which, severed from man, has become objective to him, but which lies at man's source, and appeared in its living essence in Christ within the realm of humankind, after having left man for a while, in order that he might unfold his freedom. Leading thoughts. Divine Spirit manifests itself in various ways in the cosmos in the following stages. 1. In its own primal and essential being. 2. In the revelation of this being. 3. In its workings, when the being withdraws from the revelation. 4. In its wrought work, when in the universe, as this appears, no longer the divine itself, but only the forms of the divine are there. Man's present view of the natural world gives him no relation to the divine, but only to this finished work, wrought by the divine. The effects communicated to the human soul by this view of the natural world are such that man may use them, either to ally himself with the Christ powers, or with the force of Ahriman. Michael's whole aim and effort is that the pristine relation to the cosmos, which has been conserved in man from the ages of the divine manifestation in being and revelation, should, by the free effect of Michael's own example, become incorporated in the further human and cosmic evolution. For then the present naturalistic view, which tells only of the image or empty form of the divine, will be able to pass over into a higher view of nature, more befitting the spirit. This higher view of nature will have present existence in man, but it will be a human after realization of the God's relation to the cosmos during the first two stages of cosmic evolution, while giving assent in this manner to the view of the natural world which belongs to the age of consciousness, age of the spiritual soul. Anthroposophy supplements and completes this view by another, the result of observation with the awakened eye of the spirit. Michael Mystery, Chapter 7. Michael Christ in Man. For anyone who has imbued his whole mind, in all sincerity of feeling, with the inner conception of Michael's being and Michael's acts, there will also come a right understanding of how man must treat a world which is neither one of divine being nor revelation, nor workings, but is the wrought work of the gods. To look at this world with knowledge is to have before one formations, which everywhere tell with a plain voice of the divine, but in which the divine being in its own self-existence is not to be found, if one be led away by no illusions. Nor must one look only at the knowledgeable aspect of the world. True, this reveals most plainly the configuration of the world which surrounds man today. But of more essential importance for everyday life is the feeling, willing, and working in a world which may be felt in its formation to be divine, but in which no divine life can actually be experienced. To bring real ethical life into such a world as this requires those ethical impulses of which I give an indication in my philosophy of freedom. Amidst this world of past works, for the man of genuine feeling, Michael's being and Michael's present world of action may shed a shining light. Michael does not enter the physical world in a visible appearance. He remains with all his doings in a supersensible region, but one which is just on the borders of the physical world in the present evolutionary phase of the world. Thus no possibility can ever occur that any impressions made on men by Michael's actual being should lead their views of nature into fantastic realms, or tempt them to build their practical and social and ethical life within a God-wrought but not God-actuated world, on the pretense that any other impulses could be at work there, save those of which man himself must be the ethical and spiritual angel. Whether thinking or willing, men will always have to go into spiritual regions in order to find Michael. This will mean living spiritually as follows. The ways of knowledge and of life must be taken as they are, and must be taken since the 15th century. But men will hold fast to Michael's revelation. They will let this revelation shine as a light into the thoughts which they receive from nature. They will carry it as warmth in their hearts, when obliged to lead their lives in accordance with the divinely wrought world of finished works. They will not then have only in view the observation and living realization of this present world, but another state of the world too, which Michael gives them, one which is past, but which Michael, by his being and his deeds, transfers into the present. Were it otherwise, were Michael to work so that he transferred his actions into that physical world which man, at the present day, must know and experience as such, then man would learn from the world at the present day not what actually is in the world, but what was. Wherever this happens, the human soul is led by this illusory reading of the world out of its own reality, that is fitted to it, into a reality of another sort, namely a luciferic one. The way which Michael takes to bring the past as an active force into present human life is a way that follows the right spiritual lines of cosmic progress, and has in it nothing luciferic. It is important for the human soul to understand this, and to keep before it a clear conception of the way in which, in Michael's mission, everything luciferic is avoided. This attitude towards the light now dawning on the history of mankind, towards the light of Michael, means also finding the right road to the Christ. Michael will give the right orientation when it is a question of the world which lies all about man, and calls on him to know and act in it. The way to Christ must be found within. It is quite comprehensible, at a time when the knowledge of nature has assumed the form given it by the last 500 years, that the knowledge of the supersensible world should also have become such as mankind today make it in their lives. It is necessary that nature should be so learnt and so lived, that everything is emptied of its gods, and hence, in the form he has thus given to his relations with nature, man fails any longer to find himself. That relation of himself to nature, which is the fitting one for the age, gives mankind, inasmuch as he is a supersensible being, nothing whatever as to his own nature and being. Nor does this attitude, if it is all that he looks to, enable him to live ethically in a way befitting his manhood. Hence the tendency arises not to let this form of knowledge and of life enter into anything which has to do with man's supersensible being, or indeed with the supersensible world at all. The latter is made into a field of knowledge set apart from that which is attainable by human powers of cognition. As against the field of what is knowable, another, extra-scientific or super-scientific field is marked off for revelation by faith. But in active contrast to all this is the pure spiritual efficacy of the Christ. Ever since the mystery of Golgotha, Christ can be reached by the human soul, and the soul's relation to him has no need to remain a dim and vague mysticism of feeling. It can be a perfectly concrete relation, one to be realized with all the depth and clearness of the entire man. When this is so, then there flows into the human soul, from her life together with the Christ, the knowledge which the soul needs about his own supersensible being. The revelation of faith must then be so embraced, that through it there runs unceasingly the stream of actual living Christ experience. The whole of life will thereby receive its christening, when in the Christ is recognized he who gives to the human soul the understanding vision of her own supersensible being. Thus may stand side by side, as realization of the inner life, Michael realization and Christ realization. Through Michael, man will find his right way to the supersensible in respect to external nature. The naturalistic conception will then, without suffering any falsification, be able to take its place alongside a spiritually minded conception of the world and of man, insofar as man is a creature of the world. Through a right position towards the Christ, that which otherwise could only be received by man as a traditional revelation by faith, will be learnt by actual experience in the soul's living intercourse with Christ. The inner world of the soul, the life of inner feeling and experience, will then be realized as one illumined by the Spirit of the Spirit, the outer world of nature as a world sustained and carried by the Spirit. Were man to seek to obtain the clue to his own supersensible being, except in the life of communion with Christ, it would lead him away from his own realm of reality and to Ahriman. Christ bears within himself the impulses of the human future in the manner that is cosmically justifiable. To unite herself with him is for the human soul to receive into her the seeds of her own future as cosmically justified. Other beings that already present forms which cosmically will only be justifiable for man in the future are beings that belong to the Ahrimanic sphere. The right form of union with Christ is at the same time the right form of safeguard against Ahriman. Those people who strictly insist on the revelations of faith being safeguarded against the intrusion of any influences from human powers of knowledge are actuated by the unconscious fear that if man once enters upon this path, he will fall under Ahrimanic influences. This must be understood, but it should also be understood that it is, in reality, to the honour of Christ and to his true recognition, when to Christ and to realization of life with him is ascribed the gracious inflow of the Spirit into the soul of man. Thus Michael realization and Christ realization may stand in the future side by side. So will man find his right way, the way of freedom, between Lucifer, who leads him astray into illusions of thought and life, and Ahriman, who enters him into forms of the future which gratify his pride, but can nevertheless not be his as yet in the present. To fall a victim to Lucifer's illusions means not to be willing to advance to the stage of freedom, but to stop short as God-man at a too early stage in evolution. To fall a victim to Ahriman's enticements means not to be willing to wait until the right cosmic moment has come at a definite stage of humanity, but to want to take this stage before its time. Michael Christ will stand in the future as the sign of the head of the way along which man must travel in order to keep the right cosmic direction between the two powers of Lucifer and Ahriman, and so arrive at his world destination. Leading thoughts. Man journeys on his way through the cosmos in such a manner that his gazing backward into the bygone world may be falsified by the impulses of Lucifer, and his thinking forward into the future may be cheated by the enticements of Ahriman. The right position towards Lucifer and his falsities will be found when man imbues his whole mind, in respect both to knowledge and to life, with a sense of the being and the mission of Michael. Thereby man safeguards himself also against Ahriman and his lures. For that spiritual path by which Michael directs man's mind into external nature leads him to a right position towards Ahriman, because he finds the right realization of life in communion with Christ. Michael Mystery, Chapter 8. Michael's mission in the cosmic age of human freedom. When one inwardly pursues the course of spiritual life down to Michael's workings at the present day, it becomes possible to obtain a light from spiritual science upon freedom in its cosmic character. This does not apply to my philosophy of freedom, which is something that proceeds from the purely human powers of cognition themselves, if once they can enter upon the field of the spirit. To arrive at the knowledge there arrived at requires so far no intercourse with beings of other worlds. But the philosophy of freedom makes, one may say, a good preparation for that other knowledge about freedom which may afterwards be learnt in spiritual intercourse with Michael. And this is as follows. If freedom is really to have life in human actions, that which is performed in freedom's light must in no way be dependent upon the human physical and etheric organization. A free performance can proceed from the eye alone, and the astral body must also be able to vibrate along with the free action of the eye, so as to transmit it to the physical and ether bodies. This, however, is only one side of the matter. The other side is the one that becomes clear in connection with Michael's mission, namely, whatever a man realizes in freedom in his inward life must again have no sort of action upon his etheric nor physical body. Were it to do so, the man would inevitably be brought completely out of line with all that he has come to be during the different stages of his evolution under the influence of divine spiritual being and divine spiritual revelation. What man brings to realization in his inward life from all that is the wrought work only of divine spirits round about him must exert no influence of any but his spiritual part, his eye. The only thing that may influence his physical and etheric organism is what comes through the evolutionary stream, not in his surroundings, but in his own being itself, as the continuation of what had its first beginnings in the being and revelation of divine spirit. But this element in the human being must on no account become involved in its workings with what lives in the element of freedom. What alone makes this possible is that Michael carries over from a very remote past in evolution something which gives man a link with that divine spiritual reality which no longer intervenes in the present day in the physical and etheric structures, so that by this means there grows up in the Michael mission the basis for an intercourse between man and the spiritual world, which does not interfere in the workings of nature. It is elevating to watch how, through Michael, man's being becomes lifted ever higher into the spiritual sphere, whilst what is going on below, unconscious and subconscious, beneath the sphere of freedom, becomes ever more deeply wedded to the world of matter. Man will find his relation to world being growing ever more incomprehensible as time goes on, unless he will consent to recognize his relation, not merely with natural beings and natural processes, but also with things of another kind, such as the Michael mission. One's relations to the natural world are something that one learns to know as viewed from outside. Relations with the spiritual world proceed from something like an inner conversation with a reality of being, to which one has opened access by one's readiness to view the world in a spiritual aspect. For man, therefore, to carry the impulses of freedom into actual life, he must be in a position to hold aloof from his own being certain affectations of nature that act upon his being from out of the cosmos, and to keep them from affecting it. This holding aloof goes on then in the subconscious, whilst in the consciousness those other forces are at work, which represent the life of the I in freedom. For the man's inward perception, there is this consciousness of creative freedom. For the spiritual beings connected with man from other world spheres, it is different. The being from the hierarchy of the angeli, whose work it is to conduct the man's identity from one earth life to another, becomes at once visibly aware that man is repelling cosmic forces which are seeking to continue his development, forces which are seeking to give the necessary physical support to his I system, as they did previous to the age of Michael. Michael, as a being from the hierarchy of the archangeli, receives his impressions by aid of the beings from the angeli hierarchy. He devotes himself to the task of conveying to man from the spiritual part of the cosmos, in the manner described, forces which can replace the suppressed forces of his natural existence. This he accomplishes by bringing all he does into most perfect unison with the mystery of Golgotha. The workings of the Christ in earthly evolution contain the forces which man needs when he works in freedom, in order to make good the suppressed impulses of nature. Only man must then actually bring his soul into that inner intercourse of life with the Christ, already spoken of in these descriptions of the Michael mission. Man is conscious of being in the midst of a reality when he stands in the face of the physical sun, and it gives him warmth and light. Even so, he must live before the face of the spiritual sun, the Christ, who has united his life with the life of earth, and from this spiritual sun he must receive, alive within his soul, what in the spiritual world corresponds to warmth and light. He will feel himself filled through and through with spiritual warmth when he realizes the life of the Christ within him. And feeling how this warmth flows through him, he will say, "This warmth dissolves my human being from bonds with the cosmos, which must not hold it. The divine spiritual being of yore led me to regions where its needs must leave me, in order that I might achieve my freedom. But in these regions it has given to me the Christ, that from his forces I may receive as a free man what the divine spiritual being of yore once gave to me by way of nature. which in those days was also the way of the spirit. To the divine source whence I came, this warmth leads me back once more. And as this feeling rises in him, man's sense of his life in and with the Christ will become one in inner soul warmth with his sense of real true manhood. Christ gives me my human being. This will be a dominant feeling, breathing, pulsing through all the soul. And if this feeling be once there will come to that other feeling, where man feels himself by Christ lifted up above the life of earth, and feels himself one with the stars that environ the earth, and with all that may be read in this starry environment of the spiritual and divine. So too will it be with the spiritual light. Man can have the full feeling of himself and his own being as a man, when he wakens to the consciousness of himself as a man, when he wakens to the consciousness of himself as a free individual. Nevertheless, this is accompanied with a certain darkness. The divine and spiritual of ancient days no longer shines. In the light which Christ brings to the eye of man, the ancient primal light is there once more. In such a life in community with Christ, the thought may arise, shedding bliss and brightness like the sun through the whole soul. The divine light of old is there in all its pristine glory. It shines, though not with the light of nature. A man unites himself in the present with the spiritual cosmic light powers of the past that shone in the times before he was a free individual. In this light, he can find the path which will lead him aright as human being, if he understandably unites himself in soul with the Michael mission. In the spirit's warmth, man will feel the impulse that can carry him on in such a way into his cosmic future, that he can there remain true to the gifts given him by the divine spirit beings at his origin, notwithstanding that he has since developed in their worlds to a free individuality. And in the spirit's light he will find the power which will lead him, with open eyes and even higher and broader consciousness, to that world where he shall find himself again as free man in the company of the gods in his first origin. To want to remain in the first original state of existence, to want to keep the original naive simplicity of divine goodness, of the time when the gods ruled in man, and to shrink from making use of his freedom, this leads man in the present-day world, where everything is disposed for the evolution of his freedom, only in the end to Lucifer, whose aim it is to see the present world repudiated. To give himself over to the present state of existence, to admit through all the worlds nothing save the rule of that natural law, accessible to the present-day intellect, to which goodness is a neutral matter, to want to enjoy the use of freedom in the intellect along this in the present-day world, where everything is disposed for the evolution of his freedom, only in the end to Lucifer, whose aim it is to see the present world repudiated. To give himself over to the present state of existence, to admit through all the worlds nothing save the rule of that natural law, accessible to the present-day intellect, to which goodness is a neutral matter, to want to enjoy the use of freedom in the intellect alone. This in the present-day world, where, while freedom reigns in the upper world, evolution must be carried further in the deeper regions of the soul, only leads man in the end to Ahriman, whose aim it is to see the present world transformed entirely into the cosmos of intellectual being. In regions such as this, where man is able to feel that when he turns his eyes upon the outer world they fall spiritually upon Michael, and when he turns them to the inner world of the soul they fall spiritually upon Christ, here he will gather such security of soul and spirit as shall enable him to travel along that cosmic road, on which without the loss of his first origin he shall find the true and right consummation of his future. Leading thought. Free action can only be one in which no process of nature, in or outside of man, plays a part. The polaric counterproposition in this, in all free action of human individuality, a process of nature in man is suppressed, which in an unfree action would be there, and would give the man's being the formation cosmically predestined for it. This formation of his being, which a man fails to receive by the natural road if in his life and being he follows the course of cosmic evolution for its present and future stages, comes to him by a spiritual road through the union with Michael, whereby he also finds the way to Christ. The Michael Mystery, Chapter 9. World Thoughts in Michael and World Thoughts in Ahriman. In contemplating the relation between Michael and Ahriman, one is unavoidably led to the question, what position do these two spiritual powers occupy towards one another in the whole cosmic interrelation, inasmuch as both of them are engaged in the involution of the intellectual forces? Michael exercised the power of the intellect throughout the cosmos in past times. He did so then as servant of the divine spiritual powers, to whom he himself, as well as man, owes his origin. And this original relation to the intellectual force it is his will to maintain. When this intellectual force became detached from the divine spiritual powers, to find its way into the mind of the human being, Michael determined forthwith to place himself in a right position towards mankind, so as to establish in man his own relation with the intellectual force. He proposed, however, to do this all, as before, solely in accordance with the designs of the divine spiritual powers, and to continue to act as the servant of these powers, with whom he, like man, is united from his origin. It is his purpose, therefore, that in future the intellectual stream should flow through the hearts of men, yet still as the same force which it was then when first it flowed forth from the divine spiritual powers in the beginning. With Ahriman it is very different. This being has long since detached himself from the evolutionary stream to which those divine spiritual powers belong of whom we are speaking. Already in a remote past he had set himself up beside them as an independent cosmic power, and now, at the present time, he stands spatially in the same world to which man belongs, but enters into no combination of forces with the beings who belong by rights to this world. Only when the intellectual force becomes detached from the divine spiritual beings and passes over to the world of man, Ahriman finds such an affinity to this intellectual force that he is able, through it, to unite himself after his own fashion with mankind. For what man receives at the present time as a gift from the cosmos, Ahriman united with himself long ago in remote ages. Ahriman, were he to succeed in his intentions, would make the intellect that mankind has received similar to his own. Now Ahriman acquired possession of the intellectual force at a time when he could not convert it into inward life. It remained in his being as a force that has nothing to do with the heart and soul. A chill and frosty, soulless cosmic impulse is the intellectual power as it streams from Ahriman. And the men who are overtaken by this impulse evolve chains of reasoning in which, in merciless and heartless fashion, the logic seems to speak for itself. In reality it is Ahriman who is speaking through it, and which show no sign of any real inward connection of the man's heart and soul with what he is thinking and saying and doing. Michael has never appropriated the power of intellect to himself. He administers it as a divine spiritual force, feeling himself in union with the divine spiritual powers. And this intellectual force, when Michael wields it, shows itself to be as well capable of being made an expression of the heart and soul as of the head and mind. For Michael bears within him all the first forces of the gods of his origin and men's, and therefore nothing of chill frost nor soullessness is by him conveyed into the reasonings of the intellect. but he upholds these reasonings with heartfelt earnestness and warmth of soul. And herein too lies the reason why Michael's face and bearing are grave, as he journeys through the cosmos. To be thus bound up in the inner life of the intelligence that is the world's substance means at the same time fulfilling the condition that one introduce into this intelligent substance nothing of arbitrary volition, of subjective aims or desires. Else, logical reasoning becomes the arbitrary choice of a single person, instead of being the expression of the cosmos. Strictly to keep his own being an expression of well-being, whatever of private self may stir within, to keep it within. This Michael regards as his more especial virtue. His mind is bent upon the great cosmic relations. This speaks in his countenance. His will shall go forth to men as a reflection of that which he discerns in the cosmos. This speaks in his bearing, his gestures. Michael is in all things grave, for gravity in the face of any being is the reflection of the cosmos in this being. A smiling countenance is the expression of that which shines forth from the being itself into the world. One of the imaginations of Michael is as follows. He reigns through the course of time, bearing the light of the cosmos as living being of his being, fashioning the warmth of the cosmos as revelation of his own being. He wends as one being like a world, affirming himself inasmuch only as he affirms the world, as though from all stations of the universe guiding forces to the earth below. And, in contrast, an imagination of Ahriman. Ahriman, in his course, from timeward rings space. Around him is darkness, into which he projects the rays of his own light. The more he achieves his ends, the keener grows the frost about him. He moves like a world contracted into one single being, his own. Affirming himself only by negating the world, he moves as though he brought with him uncanny forces from the dark caverns of the earth. When man pursues freedom, but with no leaning towards egoism, when freedom is to him pure love for the action he seeks to perform, then it is possible for him to draw near to Michael. If he seeks freedom in order to afford scope for his egoism, if freedom be to him the pride of feeling that in the action he gives expression to himself, then he is in imminent danger of falling into Ahriman's domain. The imaginations above described shine forth from a man's love toward the action he performs. Then it is Michael, or else from self-love of his own person in the performance. Then it is Ahriman. When man, as a free being, feels himself near to Michael, then he is on the way to convey the intellectual power into his whole man. He thinks, it is true, with his head, but his heart feels the light or dark of the thinking. Will pours man's inner being forth in light. When thoughts flow through the will with force of purpose, man grows ever more man, as he grows to be an expression of the world. He finds himself, not by sinking himself, but by uniting himself to the world with will in love. When man, in the enjoyment of his freedom, lets himself be seduced by Ahriman, he becomes caught up into the intellectual process as into a spiritual automatism, in which he is a bit of the machinery, no longer himself. All his thinking becomes an affair of the heart, and the head severs the thinking from the life of his own individual heart and individual will, and altogether blots out his own individuality. In making himself an expression of his own separate self, the man becomes ever less and less the expression of his innermost, characteristically human being. In seeking himself, he loses himself. He withdraws from the world from which he withholds his love. Man realizes himself in truth only when he loves the world. From the picture here drawn, it is plain to see how Michael is men's guide to the Christ. With all the gravity of his being, his bearing, his actions, Michael goes through the world in love. He who follows Michael cherishes love in relations with the outer world. And love must unfold itself first in relations with the outer world, else it turns to self-love. But if this be this love, as cherished in the Michael mind, the love for others will be reflected back into the personal self. The self will then love without love in itself. And on the path of such love as this, Christ is to be found by the soul of man. He who follows Michael cherishes love in relations with the outer world, and thereby finds that relation to the inner world of his own soul, which brings him together with Christ. The age now beginning to dawn requires that men's eyes should be turned to a world which lies, a spiritual world, on the very borders of the seemingly physical one, and in which they may find things such as the Michael being and the Michael mission here described. For that world, which man paints to himself as a picture of the natural world from the view he has of the seemingly physical one, is not even that world in which he is immediately living, but one that lies as far below the real world of man as the Michael world lies above it. Only man does not notice that unconsciously. When he sets out to paint his own world, it is really the picture of another which emerges. In the very painting of this picture, he has already begun to eliminate himself and to fall into spiritual automatism. Man can only save his manhood when, over against this picture, when he takes for a view of nature, and where he himself is lost, he sets that other one, which shows Michael as he rides on high, Michael leading the way to Christ. Leading force. Anything which is a working force in the world, as for instance the world force, is not recognized in its true character and meaning for the world if one looks only at the force per se which is working. One must go further and distinguish the beings from whom the action of the force proceeds, with the world force, for instance, whether it is Michael or Ahriman who brings them into the world and maintains them here. The same thing which, proceeding from one being, may work helpfully and recreatively because of this particular being's relation to the world, may have a baneful and destructive action when it proceeds from a different being. The world thoughts carry man on towards the future when he receives them from Michael. They lead him away from the future of his own welfare when Ahriman can instill them into him. By such reflections, one is led more and more to get beyond the view of an indefinite spiritual existence, some pantheistic sea of causation at the base of all things, and to pass on to a view more definite and concrete, that rises to conceptions of the distinct spiritual beings of the higher hierarchies. For in truth, reality consists everywhere in forms of living being. Whatever in reality is not living being is action that takes place in the relations of being to being. And this action can only be understood when one has sight of the beings who are acting.